strategy,
design,
marketing,
UX,
digital.
development.
This is Agencies That Build. This show is dedicated to leaders and teams that design and deploy in the digital world. My name is Jessie, and I'm a marketer and an agency owner.
And I'm Varun. I'm not a marketer, but a coder and an agency partner.
This show is sponsored by Together We Ship,
On a mission to help agencies grow.
All right, rock on. Varun, my friend, how are you?
I'm good. I'm super excited for today's guest because he has been the front runner of the 4-day work week. Have been doing it for so long, and I would love to, know more about it. So I'll let you.
You're stealing some of his thunder. I'll say that right now. All right, let me introduce our guest today. Is a creative entrepreneur and sustainability advocate. He is a driver behind a social impact creative agency with creative experience and expertise. He founded Cosmic in 2012, which has become a leading agency in the sustainability space, working with clients to develop impactful branding and marketing strategies that promote sustainability and drive positive change. Please welcome today's guest, who we're going to start talking about something different, founder and creative director at Cosmic, Eric Ressler. Welcome to the podcast, Eric.
Yeah, thank you guys for having me on. I'm excited.
We're excited. All right, so let's dive in. Since Varun stole a little bit of your thunder, what is the bogus strategy, misconception, myth that you'd like to set the record straight on?
So in the agency world, there is this culture and myth of overwork and working long hours and really essentially giving up your life for the agency world in a lot of ways. And I think that is shifting. It's something that we've essentially opted out of from the very beginning. And we do that in a number of different ways. The most concrete, defiant example is that we work a 4-day work week, and we can kind of talk more about that. We've been doing that since 2011. And it's starting to gain a lot of popularity even in the last year with a lot of trials in various countries and organizations, which is really cool, showing some good outcomes and benefits to it, which we've seen as well. But I think this grind or hustle culture that's pretty prevalent in the agency world and has been for a long time, especially like the big ad world, but also in startup culture as well. And we've experienced it from both sides, being an agency ourselves and working with a lot of startups in the early days. And I think one of the things that we think about as a creative agency is that creativity is something that you can't brute force. You can do that for a certain amount of time. You can grind, you can hustle, you can push really hard, but you also need time to rest, rejuvenate, reflect, live real life where you actually get inspiration from. You actually don't get inspiration and grow by just pushing yourself as hard as you can. You need, if you're doing that and seeing outcomes, it's because you've lived life and you've seen experiences and you've had life experiences that give you the fuel that you need to produce creative work. So what we've been experimenting with in various ways is how can we optimize for creative output and a more sustainable approach to running an agency.
It doesn't sound like you are experimenting since you have been doing it for so long. I mean, you are like a matured model already. I mean, I would love to know what was the inspiration behind this. I mean, I'm sure there's so many, well, you said so many things and I have so many follow-ups, but I think I want to start with the inspiration when you started it, why you started it, and of course, the benefit that you have seen for yourself. There are benefits that, we have heard from other countries, but for you, for your team, what was the result?
The spark of it was selfish. I didn't want to work 5 days a week. And I started
to
think
the
about
honesty of that.
and I think where I go with this and in general, how I think about running a team and creating a culture is if I don't want to do it, my employees probably don't either. And so I started to look at some early research and case studies where there were some companies that were running 4-day work weeks and talking about some of the benefits, and specifically talking about the productivity is not necessarily going down if you're working less hours, that there is a certain amount of output and focus that as humans we can produce each day and each week, and that working more hours does not necessarily lead to more productivity. And in fact, working slightly less hours, it turns out, is proving to be slightly more effective in terms of output and productivity, which is something that, I think a lot of like traditional managers are really concerned about. You see this through 4-day work week, you see this through remote work versus working in the office, and kind of all these like cultural divides around how work should happen coming in this kind of post-pandemic era. And I think that the benefits are not just about productivity, but that's the one that like a lot of companies would not be willing to give up, for example, because productivity leads to profit. But there's also so many benefits outside of productivity with the 4-day work week around overall what I would kind of put in the sustainability bucket, cultural sustainability of not burning people out, of allowing people to stay healthier. There's less sick days on a 4-day work week. Allowing people to just have more time with their families and to do things outside of work, to take care of their chores on Friday and have 2 full days outside of that to rest and rejuvenate. It's hard to cram stuff into 2-day weekends. We spend so much of our time working, and work is important, especially purposeful work. And I think that that's great. But if we're not able to actually bring our whole selves to that work, working more isn't helpful. It's more helpful to be able to come fully prepared, fully rested, fully creative each day and work 4 days than to come 5 days a week or 6 days a week or 7 days a week and be functioning at 60%. That's just not helpful.
So many follow-ups. Like Varun and I are like, so many questions. I think this has been a topic this season with quite a few actually agency owners in terms of how to manage through that grind culture. And some people don't. And, that's a choice they've made and they thrive on it. It goes back to the culture of your agency and what you're producing and clients you attract. And it's so interesting. I don't know, Varun, if you feel the same way. It's so interesting having conversations with agency owners and how they run things and how so different, but everyone's equally successful. Like no judgment with any of it. I'd be curious to hear like people who are looking to get started with it. What are the nuggets? Like, what is it that you're like, oh, this did not work? And like maybe one must do, one pro and one con. Let's just keep it simple there, or like, and be specific. Like, I don't know, did you have to get everybody on board within your team to be, how do you manage your clients against it? Like,
Yeah,
that was like 8 different questions. Sorry.
I can answer all of them because we've thought so deeply about this and experimented so much. So we did a lot of things wrong at first. And I can hopefully help some people avoid some of those mistakes if they want to try this. So the first thing we did that was wrong is we tried to continue to work 40-hour weeks and work 10-hour days. And turns out that's not actually that helpful. Some people do that and prefer it over even a traditional 5-day, 8-hour work week. What we found, though, especially in the winter, is that 10 hours is just a long day. And it cuts into your daily rest and rejuvenation cycle in a way that's not helpful. So you might get a longer weekend, but you have no time during the week to do things like eat dinner with your family or go do something after work, or be outside while there's still sunshine in the winter, right? So that's not all that helpful. And it turns out the key is not necessarily the number of days so much as it is the number of hours that you're working each week versus the number of hours that you're not working each week. And there's probably infinite number of ways you can kind of experiment with schedules there. Maybe you could do a 5-day, 6-hour work week. I think it really comes down to like how much of your time in hours per week are you dedicating to work versus dedicating to not work. So the first mistake I would say is like, don't do a long number of hours. Keep the hours short is part of it. We also attempted at first, out of kind of this fear, especially at the time, of clients not accepting a 4-day work week and wanting us to be kind of on call every day, even though we don't really do work that requires that. I don't know why we were so worried about this in hindsight. But
agency grind culture,
right?
We're used to it.
Yeah. So we tried to split the team so that there was always half the team in the office. So we had half the team work Monday through Thursday and half the team work Tuesday through Friday. So there was coverage, and that was not a good idea because it didn't allow enough overlap between team members. And we became a little bit less cohesive as a team because of that. And it was hard to schedule meetings and all that kind of stuff. So the only benefit of that is that the days that there wasn't overlap, it was a little easier to get deep work done. And that's something we can kind of talk about more as well, which is something that I think is an important consideration. So those are some kind of early mistakes that we made, trying to still work 40 hours a week, splitting the team across, different work schedules. I personally would advise against that. Obviously it depends on your agency and what you're doing, but we found those to be problematic and kind of pretty quickly moved away from those.
So I want to, just to set some context, I would like you to tell us about what type of work is that you do, because yes, creativity requires time, and you need to have the clear mind and have the regeneration of the energy to bring that to the work. But I wonder, that's where I would like to ask, like, does all the type of work fall in this category, or is it certain type of job that requires, or that will succeed in this model?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I don't think a 4-day work week necessarily will work for every organization. I think it'll work for 90+% of agencies, but maybe there's some niche edge cases where there's some reason why an agency must be in the office 5 or 6 or 7 days a week. Maybe in the case of like crisis management and reputation management and PR, where they have to be totally on it at all times. Maybe then they can still do 4-day weeks and split the time between team members. I will say that even that is better than a traditional work schedule, in my opinion. In terms of the kind of work that we do, and I'd say a lot of similar organizations doing similar work could probably adopt a 4-day work week and be fine and even see a lot of benefits like we have. But we do essentially brand strategy, brand building for clients. So, building identity systems, logos, type, color, messaging, kind of that core foundational branding work. We build a lot of websites, digital experiences, apps, those kind of things. We help clients launch campaigns. So it is very creative. It's a mix of strategy and implementation, which I think is, fairly common as well. So there are deadlines, there are important deadlines, there are tight turnaround jobs, but none of that is a deal breaker for a 4-day week. Because it's really about, for us, like how can we ensure that each team member shows up at their best each day, because that's going to result in the best ideas, the clearest thinking, the best strategy, the best productivity, all things that are really important for creative work and creative output, and like implementation work and implementation output as well. So, that's a very high level answer to what we do. But hopefully that provides some clarity.
Well, it answers the question of like, how do you manage from a deliverability standpoint,
Yeah.
outside of managing schedules and, creative thought takes time and is hard to estimate. Oh, I need 3.5 hours to think through how to rewrite this copy.
Yeah.
Well, I need 3.5 hours, a long walk, a good book, and a shower, because where ideas crop up in any one of those places.
Yeah.
Is it, and there's like a huge, I'm a super TikTok nerd. I'll say it. I watch a lot. I don't post, but there's a lot of these TikToks recently that have cropped up around like various generations and how they perceive work. I won't sit here and quote them, but some of the younger generations are like, look, we're going to manage two boundaries that you're putting as an employer in place, and the pushback that they're giving on what work looks like. So there is a large movement around this, but it also, how do you guys, manage like upcoming talent around this and setting expectations that work? How does that process work with your talent management within the agency piece of it?
Yeah, so this is a good segue into some of the challenges of the 4-day work week, I think, which we haven't really talked about.
Sneaky, right?
So I think that there are challenges to the 4-day work week, and you could say there are downsides even. What I've noticed, though, is that the downsides or challenges are all worth solving, because they're challenges and downsides that if you solve them will improve your effectiveness as an organization anyway. So things like, there's just physically less time to schedule meetings. There's less hours in the work week to do that. So what does that mean? That means we need to be very intentional about what meetings we do have and what meetings we don't have, and making sure that we're prepared for meetings, that they're effective, that we only invite people that are necessary. It also means that there's less work time for deep work, or heads down time, as we call it. Similar issue. How do we make sure that we schedule that for ourselves and for, individual team members? We still need to meet with clients. We still need to work and collaborate with clients. There's less time to do that. So this basically puts a lot of pressure on each of us individually and us as an organization to be extremely intentional with our time. I would argue that that is a very valuable skill, even if you're working a 5-day or 6-day or 7-day work week, or a 40 or 60 or 70-hour work week. And I would even argue that if you were better at those things, you maybe wouldn't need to work those many hours to get the same amount of work done, or to do the same quality or even better quality work. So those are some of the challenges. And when it comes to kind of team culture or talent acquisition, it's something we spend a lot of time on in interviewing new team members. And because people get very excited about the 4-day work week, even though it's becoming more popular, it's still a pretty novel opportunity to work somewhere and get paid, a full salary. We still, just to be clear, like, we don't pay people less because they're working less. It's, we're still competing in the same market for talent. So we do spend a lot of time, though, in the interview process and in the onboarding process, I think largely kind of untraining bad habits for people who are traditionally coming from working much longer hours, and even like getting through problems with this kind of more brute force approach of just putting more time in instead of being more intentional about how they're putting that time in. And I will say it might not work for everyone. Like, we've had team members that has been a bigger challenge for, and team members that it hasn't. I mean, we had some challenges when we were making the transition as a team. What I will say, though, is that it was an experiment in the early days, and we weren't sure we were going to continue it. We ran it as a trial. I think we set out to do 6 weeks on it. And it was really incredible to see how the team came together to work through and solve the problems, because we all wanted it. We all wanted it to work. And so it was extremely effective in that it really gelled the team around this kind of shared goal and shared purpose. Which I think is a really helpful benefit as well. But we do have to really talk to new potential employees about the implications and the trade-offs and the culture around a 4-day work week, because each week is very intentional and very, very intense, frankly. Like, to do it well, you have to be really on it. And so that works. Some people are cool with that and they see the value in it, and they value that trade-off, and other people don't want that pressure, and they would rather work a more even a longer week if it didn't need to be as intentional, and they'd rather have time for like water cooler chats and like hanging out and browsing Facebook an hour a day at work. Like, that's cool. Everyone's got to find their way, but that's not going to work if you're trying to be really intentional.
How we've asked a few other agency owners this too, and I'm curious to hear your answer. Specific tools that you use to manage this, because it based off what we're hearing is, with this intention, with, there needs to be this buttoned upness internally that sometimes agencies some struggle with, some don't. What are the actual tools that you guys have found that have been useful for you, whether it be systems, all of these things? Name some names, my friend, if that's okay.
Yeah, if you want apps, I can list all the apps.
What's your digital tech stack that you're using? What are a couple of things that you have found? Figma, everybody's using Figma to be able to manage. Sure. It's, revolutionizing how we all do what we do.
Yeah.
What are some of the other ones that you guys use internally that have been successful?
Yeah, well, we run sprints. I mean, I think we kind of have to start there with our clients and internally. So we have
Agile.
That, we're not a Scrum shop strictly, but we do run sprints with clients, meaning we have, an overall project schedule for each client with, key deliverables, key goals, and success metrics, like standard things like that. But we break it into weekly sprints. We present in a sprint review each week to clients. We get feedback each week, and we kind of work in sprint cycles. We do that for our internal work as well. Anything that's not client work, but that we're still trying to do as a team. So that sprint cycle is kind of the overall cadence of how we do our work and how we organize our work. We manage, Asana is basically our source of truth for all tasks and planning and, timelines and all that kind of stuff. So we use that. We use Discord as our kind of like Slack replacement.
Okay.
We used to use Slack.
Interesting.
I think we've gone through every iteration of like real-time chat at this point, starting with, was it called Hip Chat? Like back in the day.
Mhm.
I think we were like early adopters of that.
AOL Instant Messenger.
Yeah, right. Well, okay, we'll go way back. But for work, yeah, I think we switched to Discord early on when we became a distributed team, because we really liked the voice channel feature. And I don't know, Slack might have that at this point now. But this kind of what we found, because we used to have a studio, we used to work all in the same space, and early on in the pandemic, we went distributed and kind of stayed distributed since then. But we found that we made the transition really well into a distributed team, probably largely because we already had some remote team members, even though our core team was working together. But the thing that we found the hardest to replicate in a distributed framework was that kind of like unscheduled, off the cuff, like, hey, let's just chat about this thing. Like, it feels weird to say like, hey, I need to chat about this thing. Let me send you a Zoom link. It just feels like almost like too formal. And the thing that was cool about Discord, and that we still use like literally every day, is just setting up voice channels where you can kind of see who's in there. You can hop in and out, very frictionless process. And so,
Cool.
and I also think like I'm personally a huge fan of voice as a way to meet instead of always being on video. There's something nice about being on video. We do our daily stand-ups on video as a team, so we get to kind of see each other. And then the rest of the day, we're pretty much in voice channels.
The art of the phone call.
Exactly. So yeah, I mean, so Asana's source of truth. Discord is kind of where we have most of our discussion. That's like synchronous discussion. And then, we use other various tools as well. I don't know how deep you want us to go on all of this.
No,
but
that's
Yeah,
good.
this
I
is
think, yeah, Discord is one we've not talked about in this. So I know Varun's got a burning question. I can see it on his face.
So you talked about spending less hours working doesn't mean that they are paid less, which is quite interesting. I mean, which makes sense, but also from how does that translate into pricing and putting proposals for the clients? Because to them now, I assume you follow more on the value-based pricing and not on how many hours are put into, because hours do not matter from the client's perspective now. So how do you manage that flow of the work?
Yeah, we had already transitioned to more of a outcomes and values-based pricing model before the 4-day work week. I think that kind of started because the hourly model has some issues with it. And I can talk about those in brief if it would be helpful in my thinking on kind of pricing. But the hourly model from an agency standpoint is kind of higher risk unless you're willing to just be really brutal about charging by the hour, no matter how long it takes. We were never willing to do that. So for example, early on, if we would give a client an estimate and we would say, okay, our hourly rate is whatever, and we think it's going to take 10 hours. And it turns out halfway through, we realize it's actually going to be, we're not going to hit it. Like, we would still just bill the client for 10 hours. Maybe this is like too altruistic of us, or even like just bad business practice, right? Like, but it felt unfair to the client that like, oh, we estimated improperly. What I'll say is that there's usually scope increases. There's a shared responsibility for those, right? Like, there's some edge cases where clients just come and have a new idea. That's great. Those are pretty simple. But usually when there's scope disagreements, let's say, or gray areas, the client possibly could have been more clear about those things, but we also probably should have asked some questions that would have revealed those earlier. So there's some shared responsibility around that. And so I think the problem with like an hourly model is that you're kind of capping out your potential revenue as an agency, because there's only so many hours in a day, in a week, in a month, in a year that you can bill for. You can only raise your hourly rates so high before they start to become like lawyer rates, and then people start to get weird in our experience, because we have some services that we do bill that way, and people are like, my lawyer costs less than this, what's happening? So those are for like strategy work with like multiple team members in them, right? So I think we pretty quickly started to realize that like we really need to just be better about getting clear about what are you actually hoping to get from us? Like what are the, not even deliverables. I mean, deliverables are part of it, but like what's the outcome of the work that you're hoping for? And what is that worth to you? And I think that that's a little bit more of a, I guess you could call it like a project-based model. We have to do some more work up front to scope things in a little bit more detail. So that's a trade-off there. If you don't, you can say, I think it's going to be 100 to 150 hours and here's our hourly rate and we'll figure it out as we go, you know? Or on the flip side, the exact opposite would be like, you know, agile, like weekly sprint rate pricing, or like pricing by number of like dev points per week that some like agile shops will do. We've done that too. And we'll usually do that if the project goals are very unclear, or if we want to adopt a more agile approach. So usually if we're doing things that start to bleed into essentially like product development or app development, where trying to actually create a very detailed project roadmap and product requirements document, you know, maybe might not be the right way. The client might want more flexibility and not like have to sign up for a very set plan and then stick to it no matter what you learn along the way. So I think you have to kind of get creative with it. But to go back to your original question, because we've kind of meandered all around at this point, I think that we had already essentially been billing more in the kind of like outcomes and values based way. And, you know, we've had very little issue with that approach. Like at the end of the day, clients want that anyway, in our experience, because they don't care how many hours it takes us to do it. They want to know what they're going to get and how much it's going to cost one way or another.
You said a couple interesting things in there that I just want to comment on. You know, it's basically you're asking clients, what does success look like to you, regardless of the actual, you know, outcome of the deliverable. And
Yeah.
I think some agencies are really good at asking that. I think even internal teams, you know, when you're client side asking, okay, you're asking me to do a thing. What is the success of that looks like to you in your opinion? You know, shame on agencies who are not asking that, because that way you're definitely on the same page with clients. You also said something really interesting, you know, yeah, I know it was in jest, but you know, paying for expertise. Like from a lawyer perspective, when you're hiring a lawyer, they have got certain levels of education and credentials, and there's cost in maintaining that and their brain and things like that. And I think we forget that as creatives and agency people, they're paying for expertise. That's why they're looking at outsource kind of these skills. And so, you know, pricing is a whole interesting animal in itself in terms of the value in that, the value of all the creative thought. And yeah, if we could do a whole nother episode on that one. So I wanted to comment on those because I feel like they're pretty poignant. But let's pivot, because I want to talk about your niche and how you got there, because it's interesting. I don't think we've had somebody with as clear a focus as you. So sustainability, purpose-driven. How'd you get there? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, we describe our niche as the social impact sector, and it's a very intentional way of describing it. In brief, if you're not familiar with the sector, or you're just kind of vaguely familiar with it, there's so many terms like purpose-driven, et cetera, they're being kind of thrown out. Social impact sector to us is kind of comprised of a few key segments. So one would be nonprofit organizations. Another would be social enterprises or B Corps, or, you know, legal entities that are businesses, but that exist to move humanity forward in one way or another, which is kind of the thread that ties all these people together. And the third would be more on the like funding side. So like foundations, philanthropists, you know, family offices, organizations that exist to do good, but the way they do that is they give other people who are actually doing the work money and invest in them. So they'd be kind of like the corollary to like venture capitalists in the startup space. Or, you know, impact investors, right, is another kind of like flavor of those. The thread that unites all of them for us is that the organization exists at its core to solve some kind of societal issue or to move it forward. It's not a CSR campaign for them. It's not a secondary benefit. It is why they were formed. It is their core focus and purpose as an organization. We don't really care how you file your taxes as long as that's true. So that's our sector. How we got there. Well, we'd been an agency for about 7 years, and we'd been doing a lot of work with startups, B2B brands, B2C brands were near Silicon Valley and Santa Cruz at the time we were working out of an office. So naturally our network kind of tapped into a lot of the startup work that's been happening and continues to happen in Silicon Valley and this like general central Northern California region. And we realized that we were starting to kind of, the way I think about it is like we were spinning in place. Like we were okay. We were financially okay. We were doing good work, but we weren't going anywhere really. Like I felt like we were starting to kind of cap out or lose momentum in terms of our growth. And I don't necessarily mean in terms of like number of people or revenue or any of those things, although that was also true, but more just like, what did we stand for as an agency? And like, how were we meaningfully different than the 40,000+ other agencies in Northern America doing similar-ish work? And, you know, we spent a lot of time helping our clients figure that out, and we hadn't really done it for ourselves. And we used all the, you know, it's funny watching agencies try and position themselves and try and differentiate themselves when there is no meaningful difference, and hearing them say things like, well, we're full service, or we're results based, or like all these things. It's like, well, you know, who isn't those things, right? And I think what we realized through, you know, some mentoring and coaching and, you know, learning is that it really came down to needing to tighten our positioning around, you know, there's different ways to do that, but to have a meaningfully different area of expertise that would differentiate us from other agencies, where we could apply some of these fundamental skills to a particular subset of organizations and become more expert at doing that work than someone who can just kind of do that alongside other things. And we looked at our client base, we looked at work that we'd done, we looked at the market, and ultimately kind of landed on social impact as the sector that made sense for us. So we chose essentially a vertical positioning, right? We chose a vertical, you know, the other option, of course, is to choose more of like a horizontal positioning, meaning that you do a very particular thing for anyone, but do that one thing like super well. So like email marketing, right? Someone could do email marketing and just like, that's all they do. They're like experts at that, but they'll do it for anybody. And, you know, they can apply that expertise to anyone. And then of course you can kind of combine both of those and do like only certain things only for a certain sector and be extremely specialized. So we chose, because we like to work holistically, because we like to do branding work, we chose to really focus on a sector instead of say, we're only going to do just this one part. We've also just found that the types of clients that come to us need more of a holistic partner. They don't want to hire us just for one thing and then have to find other agencies to do other parts. There's still a little bit of that, but they want to be kind of like shepherded through the large transition, which is really what we do for clients. So we decided to basically put a stake in the ground and take a giant leap and really go all in on it in terms of how we positioned Cosmic, who we worked with, who we said yes to, who we said no to. And we can kind of talk a little bit about what that trajectory was like and what the transition was like, but that's really what led us to make the decision.
Yeah, no, I mean, this makes so much sense because you're right. I mean, it comes with so many benefits having niching down, because now customers would come to you because they want to work with you, not because you are just another shop, right? So does that also mean though that, well, what I've heard, and we have listened to this from other agencies, like the sales cycle reduces so much. You don't need the salespeople to that capacity to start selling. Now it's all inbound, or at least knowing you, people would want to work with you. So you said about transitioning, like how, so you were not always like that. You decided over time, and I would love to know about the transition. Like what were the challenges that, I mean, you shared some of the reasons why you decided that way, but was it hard? Was it like, you know, clear cut story like this? No, this is exactly what we wanted to do.
Oh yeah, it's the hardest thing we've ever done as an agency. So it's really hard. It's hard to have the courage to do it because it's scary, because you're saying no, and that means you have less options. Like you're placing a bet, and you know, you can do it intentionally, which is what we did. So we did research. we did a lot of strategy and thinking around like, is this a viable market? Like, I think you have to look at that. And there's things you can think about, or metrics you can even look at around, is this positioning viable? Like, even just like how many potential customers are there in this space? Even, is that enough? Is it too much? Is it too little? Right? Like some of those kind of things. But it's a courageous bet that you're placing to some degree, no matter how much research and planning you do for it. The things
would it be like any company, not to interrupt, but it would be like you were doing any sort of market sizing for any, or market research for any company that you were doing, even if you're doing for a client, doing it for yourself.
Yep.
Harder because it's personal.
Harder because it's personal. Yeah. Harder because you have to live with the choices that you make, right?
Also true.
So
Also
it's
very
easy to
true.
advise a client on something, even if you believe it's right, because
Sure,
then
go do that.
they have to go do it afterwards,
Yeah.
right? So when you're doing it for yourself, you're essentially your own client and you have to listen to your own advice.
True.
So I think, it's the challenges. There's a lot of challenges. So the first challenge is like making a choice around, or even a series of options and kind of like whittling that down, which is what we did. So that's challenge one. Challenge two is you have to essentially rebrand, right? To do that effectively, at least in your messaging, and kind of how you articulate your positioning as a firm. And you need to do that clearly, which is hard, it turns out. And then you have to, the hardest part is that when you first make that choice, you are only marketing differently. You don't actually have more expertise in that niche than any other given agency, because you're starting from scratch at some level. Now, we had done a lot of work in the social impact space alongside our other clients, so we had some expertise there, but you're not actually more of an expert in that niche until you've done work in that niche for a certain amount of time and started to see patterns and started to really understand who's in that niche, what are their distinct needs and pain points and challenges and opportunities, because essentially like building expertise only happens through doing enough work for enough similar people that you start to see patterns and you start to actually understand more about that space than any other agency doing work in general.
I would say though, it depends on when you're making the niche decision. Starting out, sure, that's probably true. But having, back to the earlier comment, you're paying for expertise depending, what lawyer you decide to bring into your firm. People have different kind of expertise there. For example, I haven't done any work in like biomedical, not an area of my expertise. I don't tend to take projects there. There's all kinds of rules and regulations. I'm like, I'm good. Cybersecurity, yep, sign me up, no problem. It's so I think to your point, but also not to your point. It depends on how you've decided and when you've decided to make that decision. You might have a social passion behind it. Let's say you love animals and pets and things like that, and you have some expertise there, and then all of a sudden you start getting clients in that way. So that it could grow out of that. So
I think I totally agree. I think that's absolutely true. And
goes both ways.
I think it's that you're at the beginning of that journey to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, similar to like if you decide you're going to become a PhD in some discipline, you have some foundational knowledge, but you're not a PhD until you're done. Right.
True.
So like that's
True,
a more
true.
concrete example. But so I think the way that we thought about it and making that choice and the way that we actually acted is like, we have a lot of learning to do right now around this niche, because we have some foundational knowledge by doing some of this work and observing and talking to clients. But because we have not spent all of our effort on just this niche, we don't have the, like, for example, after doing it for as long as we have now, we know a lot of things about the space from various client experiences working with clients that we didn't know when we first started.
Yeah.
What I'll also say is that it depends on the discipline side of things. So like the work that we're doing right now, there's like, I don't know, 70 to 80% of just like good foundational skills and best practices that are similar for branding a social impact organization versus branding a B2C brand. But there's that like 30% that's a little different in terms of how you do it, from a messaging standpoint, especially like how do you sell a vision for a better future versus a dashboard for an enterprise corporation, there's differences there, right? Are there still some foundational elements around like messaging, positioning, branding, design that translate? Of course, but there is some distinction there that if you don't understand that distinction, there's going to be some stumbling blocks along the way.
You spoke about the learning that you need to constantly keep doing. Like as a business owner, as an agency owner, as an entrepreneur, I would love to know where do you, like you as a person, get your learning from? Which communities you join? Where do you hang out? Where do you know and keep yourself up to date? Not about the industry of social impact businesses, but like an agency life, agency business. How do you keep yourself on track and making sure you are not missing out on things that other owners must be doing?
Yeah, I mean, I break it down into a few categories. So like one would be like having a finger on the pulse of the industry, right? In terms of like where design is going, where the creative industry is going. And, it's kind of, I would say it's a mix of things, right? It's like newsletters I'm subscribed to. It's my LinkedIn feed and who I follow there. We have an inspiration channel in our Discord that we all post, case studies, and we follow shops. We follow people. It used to be Dribbble back in the day, and it hasn't been for a long time. I don't mean anything against Dribbble. I'm sure there's still really good stuff happening there, but it's changed. I feel like there's not as cohesive as like it used to be. A little bit more centralized in my experience. There were like a few key outlets like Behance, Dribbble, a few key magazines that had become digital. And now I think it's much more niche. I think this is kind of just true for media and content in general these days, as there's smaller niche communities. You follow individual designers, you follow, individual thought leaders more. So it's kind of a mix of like newsletters, following people on various social channels, social sharing of things, like our team members stumbling upon something and sharing with us. So I'd say from a creativity side, that's kind of how it happens. And then from like a business operations side, I would say it's kind of a mix of like podcasts like this that are focused on, agencies or consultants who help agencies, business books, right? Like even at some level, some of this knowledge I've kind of picked up. And usually what happens is I get to a point where I'm feeling frustrated about the trajectory of the business. And I go into this like deep learning mode where I just like binge books, podcasts, articles, looking for answers, looking for inspiration, looking for ideas. Those tend to happen more in kind of fits and starts. And then the creative inspiration happens consistently, just out of a kind of curiosity for art, design, what's happening out there.
Like Varun and I are both nodding at that one in particular, because I know I definitely do it.
All the time. I think this is super important. I mean, I look at it this way, like, yes, there are times when you feel frustrated and business either, not going as per your expectations, but that's the time when you need rest, like you said, like you need that time. But from the learning perspective, my thought is like a different. I like to do the learning as a constant, like a daily habit of mine, versus not going on a need basis. You need learning every single day. So there has to be a slot for that. So for me, there's a dedicated time of a day where I am either spending my time reading, listening, or watching, all about information that I can take and can apply at any point, which makes my team drive nuts, because now I'm coming up with all these ideas every day because I'm taking those ideas in. So that is a con. That is the consequence of doing all of that. Anyway, so but still, it helps. It helps me stay excited all the time about the business I am in and the industry in which we are, working in. So.
Yeah, I would say the other thing has always been writing. And we mostly write about how we solve client problems, and like learning's kind of more in the work versus like the business operations side of things. Although we've written about that a little bit sometimes too. Like we've written about the 4-day work week before, we've written about sprints and like some of our process. But you really like writing isn't actually like just sharing your ideas. It's kind of where you actually turns out develop a lot of them, because you think you understand something, until you have to write it. And then you go to
Mhm.
write it and you're like, oh, I actually don't know nearly as much about this as I thought I did. So actually the act of writing, I think, is really important for distilling, crystallizing, generating even ideas. And then conversations like this, where, you know, you guys ask me questions about this and I have to think, I have to formulate answers. Like, this is learning to me too. Sharing is learning. So I think it's not like you do need to, there's like inputs and then there's like the
Yeah.
actual like thinking
Yeah.
that you have to do with the inputs and developing your own point of view on them.
That's an interesting observation about writing. I actually here's a learning moment. You know, I never thought about it that way in terms of like being able, you know, there's the philosophy around the learning, the regurgitating and the teaching, you know, and when you get to that teaching level, I don't think those are the right levels, but you guys are familiar with this. The sentence is, when you can teach something, it means you actually know it, you know, you're at that expert level. But the idea of writing and being able to put the words on whatever sort of paper you're using helps, not that you're going to share it with the world, but helps the act of thinking through the process behind it. So this has been I wasn't sure where we're going to go today. I'm not going to lie. We ended up in a couple of really interesting, you know, food for thought nuggets in this episode. So one more final question for you. What's exciting you about the future?
Oh man, so many things. I mean, so I think there's a lot of stuff to be hopeful for in the future. Like, I think in my niche, for example, in social impact, there's definitely some big changes I think are for the better in terms of like how funding is flowing, how these kind of organizations can get more support. So I see a lot of hope for organizations in our niche really growing and becoming more influential, becoming more savvy, like leveraging design, leveraging technology in ways that they haven't in the past, and funders being willing to fund some of that. So there's some really good stuff there. I mean, I think we're in an incredibly interesting period of civilization in so many ways right now. We've gone through a global pandemic, not that it's like officially over, or maybe it is officially over, but not practically over. We like work culture is being completely rewritten, and, you know, to the not that managers are super happy about it right now. AI is coming in and shaking up the entire way that work is going to happen. And there's just so much change. And I think change is scary, but change is also interesting. And I think my hope is that this shakeup will actually lead to more just and equitable ways of working, and not just benefit people who are already in positions of power and wealth. You know, if you look at history, the likelihood of that happening is probably not as high, but I do think there's been some progress there. And I'm hoping that this, especially newer generations who are rightfully fighting for these things, can use these opportunities and this time of change to actually create better structures and systems for living.
Would be nice, wouldn't it? Well, thank you so much for your time today. This was a great conversation. For those of you listening, watching, consuming, you can find Eric and Design by Cosmic on their website, designbycosmic.com. I said that super awkwardly. Designbycosmic.com, that's your website. So, and then you're on the LinkedIn as well. I know you guys produce a ton of content. So thanks so much. And that's it, folks.
Thanks
If
for
you
having me
learn-
on. I enjoyed the conversation.
We did too. This was a lot of good nuggets. So that's it, everyone. If you learned something today or laughed, tell somebody about the podcast. Have a great day. Thanks for listening. Find our other episodes on agencies.build.com. Plus, we're listed anywhere you find your favorite podcast.